What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5C. So this is episode 6, and we're going to talk about going back to basics in this video. So for this video, I'm going to be paralleling what I'm putting out on my R5 tips and tricks series of videos, at least for the next couple of videos. So we're talking about video resolution in this video. We'll talk about frame rate in the next one and compression in the third one. Now, I do want to note that the target audience for people in this video is not experienced Canon cinema owners, camera owners. You guys already probably know all of this, and I don't have enough technical detail digging into the R5C's actual performance into the camera's actual performance to be able to really fill out a picture in that respect with this at this time. It's something I'm looking at working on. It's something that involves a little bit more complexity than I'm available to deal with at the moment. So this is really targeted at people like me. So people who shoot with or shot with Canon hybrid cameras or Canon DSLRs and are looking at upgrading from, say, an R5 to an R5C, or really any of Canon cinema cameras, as most of what I'm going to be talking about in this video with respect to resolution actually applies to changing resolutions and resolution settings on other cameras. Obviously, most other cameras in Canon cinema line aren't going to have 8K available. That's specific to the R5, but the processes are pretty similar. So we've got a couple of things we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to start by talking about image quality. We're going to talk about the available resolutions for RAW formats, for the compressed formats, and for the sub recordings and proxy clips, because there are some limitations there that I'm going to touch on. And then we're going to talk about changing resolutions on the camera as a whole. So to start off, let's talk a little bit about the theoretical side of things, the impact resolution has on image quality and performance in the R5C. The way the camera gets from point A to point B means that there are some options there, or some differences there, I should say, from what you would experience on, for example, the R5. So the R5C takes a slightly different track at getting to the end result than the R5 does. Originally, I would have classified this as a quality first approach, but in retrospect and thinking about it, it really has probably more to do with the background of the operating systems and the technology that the cameras are built on and that they come from. So Canon Cinema EOS OS, which is what the R5C runs in video mode, was originally designed with sort of two aspects or two things to be considered in operation. So first of all, it was designed for higher end users. So not to say anything about people who shoot video on DSLRs or mirrorless cameras that they can't be high-end users. There are certainly aspects of TV shows that have been shot on cameras like the 5D Mark II. But when you start getting into Hollywood level productions and cinema level stuff, there's a different class and demand of how the camera has to perform. Admittedly, as a hybrid user, I'd love to have that just without all the compromises that come with it. The other aspect of this has to do with the fact that the cameras were built originally, all of the cinema cameras are built originally with cinema-focused sensors. They tend to be lower resolution, so they tend to be something that the camera can read the whole sensor out on. In fact, the R5C is the first Canon cinema camera to shoot 8K resolution. In any event, the lower resolution cinema-oriented focus means that the cinema cameras, the Cinema EOS OS specifically, generally downsamples full sensor area information to a lower output resolution. So if you're shooting in 1080p, then the camera isn't reading line skipped, generally speaking, isn't reading line skipped output from the sensor and then making a 1080p file from that. It's reading the full sensor area and then downsampling to 1080p. Now this contrasts with the Photo EOS OS, where by and large the cameras that started with that didn't have the bandwidth to be able to read out their sensors at the full resolution at video frame rates and timing, and so they adopted line skipping. And we're starting to see Canon move away from line skipping in more modern versions of their EOS DSLR or EOS hybrid photo cameras, but it's still something that's still there. So in the case of the R5, for example, There is downsampled 4K. Obviously, 4K high quality mode does that. And the camera does downsample from 5.1K to 4K or 1080 when you're shooting in movie crop mode, but it also has line skipped 4K at the full frame sensor mode in the standard recording option. So that's not something that is the case with the R5C, where in full frame mode, the only time the camera line skips that I'm aware of is when you're actually shooting in slow and fast motion with a fast motion or a high frame rate above 60 frames a second. Otherwise, the camera downsamples pretty much everything. Now, with downsampling comes some advantages and some disadvantages. On one side of the equation, we have rolling shutter. So the R5C, like the R5 and pretty much all of Canon's cameras except the global shutter cinema cameras, are rolling shutter cameras. The R5 or the R5C also predates the super high bandwidth stacked sensor design that Canon released in the R3, so it doesn't even have that advantage, but it does do a pretty good job of managing rolling shutter readout speeds. Put simply, rolling shutter is not related to, or the rolling shutter impact is not related to the output resolution. It is related to basically how many pixels have to be read and how fast the camera can read those pixels. So what this ultimately means is that if you're shooting in any of the full frame modes where the camera is shooting 8K and then downsampling, that your output video is going to have the same rolling shutter effect or level regardless of what output resolution you're shooting at. So 8K, 4K, or 2K, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be the same. Now on the R5, this is a little different because the R5 does have line skipped 4K. Obviously, when you line skip, you're reading out physically half as many or physically fewer pixels, so the rolling shutter performance can be faster. So the outstanding question for me, at least I haven't seen any good information on this, is the impact of line skipping with rolling shutter for slow and fast motion recording at frame rates below 60 frames a second. So in theory, the R5 in standard quality 4K, because it actually reads out less information than the R5C does, might actually have better rolling shutter performance in that mode. This is something that I want to test in the future at some point as soon as I can figure out a viable and effective way to do rolling shutter testing that is repeatable. The other aspect of all of this with downsampling comes down to image noise. So downsampling will always improve the image's noise characteristics. I mean, if you think about it, if you take 4 pixels and you crush them into 1 pixel, noise is random. That randomness will average out. The signal is not random, so that signal will average towards the real signal regardless of the noise. So downsampling, in addition to having impacts on making the image look a little sharper, also has impacts on making the image less noisy. Now, consequence of this is that smaller crop factors or smaller downsampling ratios downsample the image less, and so there will be less impact of that noise reduction. So put simply, if you're shooting at 1080p as an output format, which is what I do for these videos, if you're shooting at the full frame sensor and the camera's reading 8K and downsampling it to 1080p, there's a better noise reduction effect from that than compared to if I was shooting in Super 16 mode, where the camera is reading at 3K and downsampling to 1080p. Okay, so that's kind of the theoretical side of sensor stuff out of the way. There's a balancing act, obviously, between performance, battery life, etc., and those are kind of the considerations that Canon has made. Now, let's get to talking about the resolutions that the camera is using and that are available in the camera. So we're going to start by talking about raw video, because raw video is in some ways simple. Basically, if you've followed or if you've ever done any research on raw video, the way it works is the camera reads out the pixels at the sensor's native resolution for the desired crop factor, and it compresses that, stuffs it in a file. There's no post-processing done on the image data, not in the same way that it does with compressed video. So there's no rescaling, there's no chroma subsampling, there's no debayering done. In fact, even things like white balance is saved as metadata and not as actual changes to the pixel information. The consequence of this is that because the sensor is always read at its native resolution, the resolution of your raw video changes with the sensor mode, or what Canon calls the sensor mode on the R5C. You would also know it as the crop factor. So unlike the R5, where you only have raw video recording at 8K full frame, on the R5C you actually have raw video at all frames, or all of the three crop factors, so full frame, Super 35, and Super 16. Finally, like the R5, all of the raw video formats on the R5C are DCI 17:9 aspect ratio. Presumably, Canon's thinking with this, because they could easily have done a 16:9 UHD aspect ratio, is that because raw video is delivering the highest possible quality that anybody, and requires post-production, anybody who's shooting it is going to know how to deal with the aspect ratio one way or another in their videos, in their post-production workflow. It's not something that's just going to be directly uploaded to YouTube or something like that. So these are the raw resolutions that the camera has available for raw video based on the sensor mode. So in full frame, you get obviously 8K video. It's a 1.06x crop from the still format. It's the same width, but the height is lower, so that alters the crop factor. This would be 1x for cinema as a cinema crop factor, and both if you're looking at horizontal angle of view for a given lens, they're going to be the same regardless in this mode, from still photography stills to video, full frame video. So the second option is to knock the camera into Super 35 mode. In Super 35 mode, you get a 6K roughly image. It's a 1.46x crop factor for stills. Again, this is diagonal, so diagonal across the frame. It's narrow and it's smaller. It's a 1.38 crop factor from the full frame cinema image. Finally, the lowest resolution option is to shoot in Super 13 or Super 16 mode. It's a 3K image. It's about a 2.9x crop factor if you're thinking in terms of still photography frames, or 2.75x crop factor if you're thinking in terms of cinematography frames. Now, changing the raw resolution on the R5C essentially means changing the sensor mode or crop factor. So there's three ways to go about doing this. First of all, you can do it through the menus. So if you're going to go that way, you're going to go to the Record Media Setup 1 menu, and you're going to look for sensor mode and change that to whatever mode you want. If you're going to go through the second option, which is the direct touch control that's available on the camera, then you're going to touch the direct touch control virtual button. It's in the bottom left corner of the LCD on the back of the camera. Then you're going to touch the record settings virtual button. This is on the top left corner when the camera is in direct touch control mode. And then you're going to change the sensor mode on the first page of the direct touch control, or the record settings menu there. Finally, you can program a button to directly take you to the sensor mode menu setting. I'm not going to go into the details here, as button customization on the R5C is actually more comprehensive, more powerful, and more extensive than it is on a camera like the R5. And it really warrants talking about it in its own video. But if that's something that you really need to change a lot, you can make it a function of a button. Speaking of the direct touch control menu and the record settings page, I will do a whole video on the direct touch control menu as a whole, but I just want to give you a quick lay of the land, because this is a pretty useful place to make camera setting changes. It's broken into the record settings menu there is broken into 3 pages. So the first page is essentially global settings for the camera. Here's where you can control the sensor mode, how the second card is going to be used for recording, where your main recording is being saved to, so the CF Express card or the SD card, and the recording mode, so this would be like normal, slow and fast motion, continuous, etc. Page 2 and 3 are specific settings for each of the recording options. So page 2 is the settings for the main recording on the camera. This is where you would change the compression format, so RAW, XFAVC, HEVC, etc. The resolution of that file, specifically the LUT that you are using in that file, if it's not raw video, and the frame rate that you're recording it at. Page 3 does basically the same thing, but it's for the second recording, so the proxy or sub recording that you are making with your alongside your main recording. Final, or the other option, if you're not shooting raw video, is to use the compressed formats. Of course, these are MP4 and XFAVC on the R5C. And here again, your available resolutions are going to depend on whether or not you have set the camera to, or what sensor mode you have set the camera to. So full frame, Super 35, or Super 16. In full frame, you have the full suite of resolutions available. So 8K, 4K, 2K. All of those are available in both DCI 17:9 aspect ratios and UHD 16:9 aspect ratios, as well as a 1280 by 720 standard high def size. So the two big differences here between the R5 and the R5C are the inclusion of a 2048 or a DCI 2K frame size and the inclusion of 1280 by 720. Now, I will point out again that because these resolutions are generally the product of downsampling, at least for normal recording modes, they're the product of downsampling, you don't get a benefit in higher frame rates. And in fact, generally across the camera, even in slow and fast motion, you are capped at 120 frames per second. You don't get a benefit of higher frame rates from going to, say, 1280 by 720. So it's not going to give you less rolling shutter for a given frame size or a higher maximum frame rate because the camera isn't line skipping to get there, and therefore it's not using, or it's not starting with less resolution. So the 1280 by 720 is probably something that you generally won't want to use. Reducing the camera sensor mode to Super 35 cuts the resolution down to about 6K from 8K, so the 8K options are no longer available. There are no standard 6K frame sizes that are, at least that are available from Canon cameras in HEVC or XFAVC or MP4 formats, even though in theory the compression could be done for that. So when you drop to Super 35, you essentially get limited to 4K, 2K, and 720p, but everything's being downsampled from that 6K starting resolution. Of course, the final setting is to bring the sensor mode to Super 16, the smallest crop factor. This is a 3K resolution image, so you only have options for 2K and 720p when you're shooting in Super 16 mode. So let's talk real quickly about additional limitations that are imposed on resolution for sub-recordings and proxy recordings. I don't use these a lot. This is not something I'm overly super familiar with or in the ins and outs and nuances, but there are a few limitations. So sub-recordings essentially act as a secondary recording to the main recording. So one place where this is used is in continuous recording mode. The camera will continuously record to your sub-recording file and using its settings, and then it will only record to the main recording file when you hit the record button. Generally speaking, this is not so much a proxy, even though it can be used that way. It is more of a alternate recording in a lot of respects. Sub-recordings are always going to be in the same aspect ratio as the main recording. Resolution also for the file will be less than or equal to the main resolution of your primary recording file. Now, if you're interested in the exact details of sub-recording settings, pages 63 to 69 in the English manual, at least the electronic version, for the video function on the camera, cover it. They're just pure tables covering all of the settings for both RAW, XFAVC, and MP4 primary files and what the sub-recordings for those can be. Now, proxy files work somewhat similar to the sub-recordings, except they are hard-capped even further. So they match the primary recording's aspect ratio and frame rate, and proxy recordings are only available in 2K, 1080p, or 720p, depending again on the source aspect ratio, the primary recording's aspect ratio. So there's not an awful lot in the way of options when it comes to changing proxy settings. So that brings me to the final point of this video, which is talking about changing the resolutions for the video files. So we already talked about changing the RAW resolution because the RAW resolution is basically changing the sensor mode. The compressed video files actually have their own resolution setting that the camera will downsample to for those files. So you have a couple of ways to do it. Again, it's very similar actually to the sensor mode for the raw files. First option is to go through the menus. So that for your primary recording file or primary files, resolution and bitrate, you're going to go to Record Media Setup 1, and then you're going to go to Resolution and Bitrate and choose the resolution that you want to be for your file to be recorded in. You can also do this through the Direct Touch Control menu. Again, touch the Direct Touch Control virtual button, touch the Record Settings virtual button. This time you're going to change to page 2. You can swipe, you can use the multi-controller, or you can use the secondary dials to get there. And then again, change the resolution and bitrate on the second page of the Direct Touch Control menu. And then of course, you can do a button to directly access the resolution and bitrate menu setting. Now for sub-recordings, the process is similar to the main resolution or main recording resolution. However, you are going to be looking on the the recording media setup 3 menu page instead of the setup 1 menu page. And the menu entry that you're going to look for is going to be a second card resolution / bitrate as opposed to just resolution / bitrate. And the Direct Touch Control, this will be on the 3rd page of the menu. And again, button function can be programmed directly to take you to the media setup or the recording media setup 3 menu, second card resolution bitrate menu entry. So that is a nutshell sort of encapsulated view of the resolutions on the R5C. Now, the R5C is obviously a lot more complicated than the R5, as there's a lot more going on. At the same time, when it comes to resolutions, it's really only 2 more raw resolutions, which are certainly useful, and 2 more compressed resolutions that you can choose from. Where things, I think, get really more complicated actually just comes in from the fact that the camera supports the second recording, and there's some limitations imposed on those second recording resolutions. So if you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.